Hi there. Good afternoon or good morning to depending wherever you are listening from. So my name is Malachy and I'm a PhD student at the University of Liverpool. I'm studying for a PhD in urban planning. So this morning my presentation is called Cycling, COVID-19 and Disruption. And as the tagline suggests, I'm going to be exploring some of the changes in cycling over the past year and a half in the Liverpool City Region. So I'm just going to start by setting out some of my kind of introduction to my methods and what I undertook for my analysis. And then I'm going to go into the main part of my presentation, which will be focusing on the kind of impact of the disruption from various lockdown restrictions over the past year and a half, and exploring some of the ways that people replace their time in terms of their kind of personal activities and also their work activities. And I'm also going to be exploring some of the disruption to kind of our infrastructure in the city region. So exploring the impact of the kind of changing amount of vehicles on the road and also some of the infrastructure measures that were implemented. And I'm also going to draw on some of the perspectives from cycle shop owners and understanding how this change in demand, both for repairs and new cycles, impacted them. And finally, I'm just going to look over some of the challenges that were introduced, particularly when the roads became busier again and some of their infrastructure started to get removed. And I'm just going to finish off with a couple of kind of key conclusions from the work that I've undertaken so far. So the field work was undertaken in Liverpool City Region, which is in the northwest of the UK. So it's the area that's just highlighted in red on the map. And it's 6 boroughs that all make up the Liverpool City Region. So I undertook 30 in-depth interviews with a range of different cyclists. So some were very experienced cyclists, others were completely new to cycling during the pandemic. And I recruited these via social media, and we undertook the interviews via kind of telephone or online software. And I complemented this with 8 interviews with cycle shop owners in the Liverpool City Region. And that was part of a wider project that I'm part of, commissioned by Decarbonate. And I transcribed and analysed these themes in Vivo, and it came out with some of the kind of key trends that were discussed during these interviews. And I undertook this research to understand kind of 2 quite kind of core questions. And they were, so the first one is, why were more people participating in cycling? So anecdotally, we've seen evidence, it's also backed up by some Department for Transport data, which kind of indicated there was quite a rush towards cycling and an increase in the cycling rates, particularly in the first few months of the pandemic. So I want to explore why is that the case in the Liverpool City Region, and to kind of the next question to understand, well, how permanent is this change going to be? You know, what can we learn from those who particularly started cycling and during this time, you know, that why they started cycling, what can be done to maximise this kind of desirable behaviour change? And to help me do so, I'm going to explore my evidence using social practice theory. So using kind of Show et al.'s version of social practice theory, which says that all practices or kind of activities are made up of 3 types of elements. These are materials, which are kind of physical entities. So for cycling, that would be something like a bike or cycling infrastructure or the road. Competencies, which are the technique and the know-how. So for cycling, this might be about, you know, manoeuvring into a busy road of traffic, wayfinding around a city. And finally, meanings. So they're what you can attach kind of symbolic ideas and meanings towards cycling. So for cycling, you know, might be danger. If you know that it's quite a busy road, it could be about relaxation or exploration, perhaps if you're on an off-road route. And as the kind of materials change, as the competencies change, you can change the meanings, or equally, you know, when the materials change, perhaps when there isn't infrastructure there, when it's a busy road, cycling might be more associated with danger than relaxation. And another aspect to practice theory is that all practices, they're in competition with each other for individuals' time and effort. So, you know, depending on what other practices are available to them or in circulation, this might help support or detract practitioners to a certain practice, such as cycling. And social practice theory also sort of emphasised the regularity and stability to practices. So I thought this was quite at odds with the disruption caused by COVID-19. And like some others, I thought that this was a good opportunity to account for rapid change in practice. So therefore, I'm using the kind of COVID-19 lockdown period as a natural experiment to explore both our cycling change and to understand how social practice theory can conceptualize this quite kind of rapid, unpredictable change. So now we're moving to the main section of the presentation. So one of the key themes, of course, throughout was the lockdown restrictions that were imposed on us all in various strength throughout the kind of past year and a half. And this meant that a huge number of activities disrupted. For some, this was about group sporting events, tennis, football. For others, it was about being unable to go visit and socialise with their friends in the pub. And of course, there was huge changes to people's work, which meant that some people were working from home, others had to start to commute previously by public transport. Maybe they started commuting by car. So this had a real effect on the way that different activities and the availability of different practices. So it seemed that cycling was a very important replacement activity for a lot of people. They couldn't do these other practices that I mentioned earlier on, so they turned to cycling. So we talked about people that were, perhaps that they weren't undertaking their usual routine in the gym. Instead, they started cycling because they noticed that they were, putting on weight. They weren't feeling so good because they weren't getting their usual benefits from all the types of exercise. So cycling was quite a good replacement practice in this case, and particularly because they had, desires and needs to be met. They wanted to, some people talked about being trapped and unable to go on holiday or visit new places. So cycling enabled them to fill that gap, and that gap to satisfy their meanings that they usually would get from doing another activity. And in particular, it continued to be so that particularly as some of the regulations changed, which meant people could be outside for longer, exercising for longer, and perhaps exercising with a friend or a family member, that cycling provided that really good mixture of, and you see those 5 bubbles down there, which were 5 of the kind of key themes that came up when they talked about these activities, ensuring that they had escapism from the house, socializing, appreciation of nature and their local green spaces. You could also do all of this while also physically exercising. So it seemed that the practice of cycling was a really great replacement activity for a lot of the individuals that we spoke to. And also that there was it helped meeting their new demands. So there was a huge amount of change in circumstances. People were working from home, they were maybe feeling a bit trapped in there. They needed a break at the end of the day, and cycling was really able to be really suitable to be able to do that. They could fit in exercise and many other benefits. And another key theme that we went through was to explore how the materials of cycling change. So, as you see on the graph on the right, you can see the black line is the cycling rates, and this is from national data from the Department for Transport. And you can see that it vastly increased in the first lockdown, and especially in the first half of that lockdown, and then gradually reduced. But as you can see on the orange line, so that was the car use, so that the traffic rates massively reduced. And that meant that the materials of cycling changed, and the roads, which were once very busy and intense to travel on, were much more amenable to new cyclists and more enjoyable to cycle on. And that meant that, a lot of people thought, well, now is a good chance to get out and start to build up some of my confidence on the roads. Another thing that was very, like in many cities, in Liverpool, they closed some of the roads and also implemented some new pop-up infrastructure. So this temporary infrastructure, again, helped lots of people get out cycling for the first time. That they thought, this new lane's here, so I can go use it. I'm separated from the traffic. I'm going to be safe. So this is a real indication of how, when the materials of cycling change, how that can change the competencies, because it means there's no longer such demands placed on individuals, that the kind of entry barrier for cycling is reduced. And this might also mean that some of the kind of associations in terms of the meanings of cycling also change. So people were, associating much more with relaxation. They weren't as stressed when they were cycling. They can enjoy themselves and notice things when they're going by, because they didn't have that kind of fear of the danger of the traffic. And this kind of material change, as I'm describing, that I believe that this kind of had three key effects. So I think it really did drive the recruitment towards cycling, because the people who previously had just cycled on pavement or maybe just in parks, they thought, well, now I can get out on some of these roads that I previously thought were too dangerous to do so. So, and as a kind of two supplementary points, this was really, expanded the range of the roads they felt comfortable and safe on, that they could travel across. And it also provided just an opportunity to boost the confidence, so it was a great opportunity to feel confident before the traffic was out again. So that was a real driver for people to maximise this opportunity. However, I need to go on to also some of the discussion of, particularly later on in the lockdown, in kind of the pandemic, you see that towards the second, the third lockdowns, that the traffic rates were actually very close to the normal rate of 100%. And this meant that there was, some of the challenges that people had before the pandemic with cycling were reoccurring. And there was also, as you see on the left-hand photo, where the bollards were, there's often some damage to them, and this kind of infrastructure that was already in place in the city or temporarily put in, as it got degraded, you can see the materials of cycling were being degraded, which once again increased the kind of competency they need, and also some of the meanings of cycling might be going towards kind of danger rather than enjoyment. So again, this is going to kind of start to limit the recruitment to cycling and start to kind of detract people who maybe cycled in the first part of the lockdown. Maybe they're starting to feel it's not so much for them now. So, and another thing that I want to, that kind of a lot of people spoke about was there's some of the issues, purchasing the materials for cycling. So that'd be a new bike, or maybe certain parts or repairs for a new bike. If you don't have this, clearly you can't cycle, and this was a real issue, particularly in the first few months, that just the capacity for repairs and supply weren't there. And this meant for many people, they didn't have the repair skills to repair the bike themselves, another kind of competency, and that created a bit of a barrier for those to kind of continue cycling. And I think that's another illustration of, maybe we often speak about the infrastructure in terms of kind of pop-up lanes, in terms of cycle lanes, in terms of storage, but the kind of infrastructure of having the cycle shops there, I think, is an important consideration too. So now, just to kind of round up what I'm saying and to start kind of a brief bit of discussion, is returning to my research questions, that in summary, why did people participate in cycling during the pandemic? So I think the key point is, one of the key points is that the limitations on other activities, both legal and kind of otherwise, meant that the competitions for individuals' time and effort was less intense. So they were more likely to choose cycling, maybe perhaps because it was one of the few choices of practice that was left. Supporting that, as you can see in these arrows, that there was the elements to require the cycle altered. So there was some additional materials put in, pop-up lanes. There was existing materials in terms of the roads and road surface. Well, they were less busy and there was more space for cycling. And the third one is that it satisfied many requirements of the individuals, that people wanted to get out, explore, have some fresh air. And this often changed during the pandemic. There's awareness that they needed to support their own mental health. So, this attracted these individuals to cycling, particularly given that the meanings were more positive and the competencies required were much lower. Secondly, think about, well, how permanent is this change going to be and what can we learn? Well, now that many other practices are, in competition to restore, it's going to be naturally more difficult to get people to continue cycling as much. And the changes to a lot of these materials are unfortunately quite temporary. We know the roads are kind of back to near to normal levels now. So the pop-up infrastructure in certain cities, including Liverpool, is starting to be removed, which is creating challenges, creating higher entry barriers for those to continue cycling. And so this can kind of tell us that when there is transformative change, which has occurred in the first few months due to the lockdown measures in the pandemic, it did lead to kind of really rapid and quite radical changes in the practice of cycling. Because of that, we saw a response in terms of the cycling rates. Once these were eased, cycling was less attractive, and it does show, like many studies before the pandemic, that the environment for cycling is just too unfit to support mass cycling currently in the UK. We've had other scholars kind of question, was the pandemic a turning point for active travel? And I think that it could well have been, but we need to see many of these changes, particularly in the materials of cycling, in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of lanes and other supporting infrastructure to cycle shops, that needs to have much more of a solid base, and we can see permanent change, quite radical change occur, but there needs to be radical action to support cycling to do so. And I think my final point was that I'm showing that social practice theory can quite usefully illustrate where there can be quite transformative large-scale change, as I've helped to explain why many more people have moved to cycling, and particularly in the first few months of lockdown. So that can help us understand what changes are required for more permanent change. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation. I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference.